So good morning, everyone. I'm Shamika Ravi, Research Director at the institution. This is a delightful, first of all, a change in timing of our normal development seminars. We usually meet in the evenings, but good to see you in the morning today. Today's seminar is quite special because we're doing a subject, a discussion on a topic which we haven't discussed in the last couple of years at the institution, but it's also a very niche topic, but of great interest because India has the third largest number of family business in the country, and this is of tremendous importance for policymakers, for the discussion largely to get more insightful. And to help us do that, today we have I think globally one of the few scholars who has a research agenda built around this topic of family business. So Dr. Vikas Mehrotra, he's the A.F. Collins Professor of Finance at the University of Alberta Business School. He has been studying family business mostly in Japan. If there is some relevance to India, of course, that's our attempt to force him to think of what the implications are for us here. But our discussant today, equally distinguished, we have Mr. Gaurav Dalmia, the chairman of the Dalmia Holdings, and he is going to discuss the findings that Professor Mehrotra provides, gives the evidence for, and then at the end we will have 25 minutes for Q&A from the floor. So first we'll start with a presentation from you, Dr. Mehrotra. You have 45 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shamika. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks to the Brookings for inviting me. So the talk today is on two sort of related topics. The first one is succession in businesses, in family businesses, and the second is exit. Why families exit the businesses that they have founded through sweat and equity and so on. So when we talk about succession, what I'm going to bring in here is some evidence on how succession and firm performance are linked. And then in the second part of the talk, when we talk about ownership, we will talk about how ownership changes over time, and how control and ownership may follow different paths. The context here is post-war Japan. And by post-war Japan, I mean from 1950 onwards. And these two talks are based on two different research projects that I am involved in. The first one is completed and it was published in a journal called the Journal of Financial Economics. And the second project is ongoing, and we hope to get that completed shortly. The first project is joint work, so is the second project. The names are on the screen there. A very, very, very quick history of Japan in 30 seconds. So this starts with Buddhism. 550 AD, Buddhism comes to Japan via Korea. And then a very long period called the Heian period in Japan, starting in about 800 AD, which was marked by a huge sort of renaissance in paintings, in books. This is the tale of the Genji, often cited as the world's first novel. And this period lasted about 400 years and was followed by the feudal period in Japan, which goes from roughly 1185 to 1868, which itself was marked by a very important battle that took place in Sekigahara in about 1600. That's sort of the pre and post feudal periods in Japan. And post Sekigahara, the Japanese landmass sort of was more united, but still under feudal so-called shogun control. Okay, so this is the shogunate part of Japan. And then the big event here is something called the arrival of Admiral Perry's black ship from the United States. And this happened in the mid-19th century, in 1854. And this really shocked the Japanese, because Admiral Perry's ship came, it was big and it had guns. And the feudal shogun there, basically Admiral Perry's demands were very simple. They wanted to open Japan. Japan was closed during the feudal period. There were very small outposts. The Dutch were allowed, the Portuguese were allowed, but even they were allowed in very designated enclaves and not allowed to sort of travel where they pleased within Japan. And Admiral Perry comes barging in the Tokyo Bay, and he demands that open up. And this sort of shocked the shogunate there. They said, we really don't have the capacity to refuse Admiral Perry's demands, so we need to do something. And that sort of led to a force within Japan that eventually gave rise to what is now called the Meiji Restoration. This was the restoration of the Meiji throne, the imperial throne, and this is the first Meiji emperor and his wife. And the Meiji Restoration sort of ended the feudal period in Japan, and Japan entered the sort of the modern age. And so in the next few decades, I would say between 1870 and the end of the 19th century, Japan underwent a very rapid, phenomenal modernization. In the sense they imported a new legal code. Before that, they were following the Taiho Code from China, and now they imported sort of a code largely based on German legal doctrines. And it also gave rise to modern businesses. Some of the business families that were there before continued on. Many new families emerged. And this was the sort of the antecedent of the Zaibatsu era, the family business era in Japan. And the Zaibatsu eras, you might be familiar with many of the names, the Sumitomo's, the Mitsubishis, the Mitsuis, and they continued on. But then at the end of the Second World War, the Americans took a very dim view of the Zaibatsus because they perceived them to be involved with the war effort. And that meant they were largely persona non grata after the war. And for a brief while, till the early 1950s, Japan was run by the GHQ. And for a very brief while, Japan resembled, at least in ownership, the United States. And then, so this is the modern era, I would say starts in about post-war 1945 to now. And this is modern Japan. This is Tokyo Station, surrounded by skyscrapers. Okay. That was a 1-minute history of Japan for those of you who are not familiar with it. So we're going to talk of two things today. We're going to talk about succession, which is very important, at least for family businesses. This is the Achilles heel in family business. Why so? Because the continuation of a business dynasty is crucially linked to the weakest link in the chain. And one weak link means that is the end of the business dynasty. Okay. Also, it means that succession issues make or break family firms. So the selection of the successor is paramount in subsequent performance for family-led businesses. Here's an example of the victorious Indian cricket team in 2011. And my question is, would you pick the 2031 World Cup cricket team based on the sons of the 2011 victorious team? And you might think that's a stupid question, but we do exactly the same thing in businesses as well as in politics, often with not very good results. Okay, I don't need to spell out names here. So limiting the talent pool to own progeny seems, in economics understated language, suboptimal. Okay. So consanguineous succession, that's a big word, just meaning blood succession, doesn't seem to be the best option. Okay. And yet we see that. Why do we see that? Is there something called a business acumen gene? Little evidence of that. Very little evidence that intelligence can be reliably inherited. Maybe there's some correlation, but the reliability of inheriting intelligence, at least the biologists have not yet discovered an intelligence or business gene.
So I think it will be interesting to also define intelligence, because different people will have different connotations to that as well.
Definitely, I'm just defining intelligence as a lack of stupidity. Fair. Okay. So that leads me to something called the pecking order of family business performance based on who is running the show. And here I'm going to give you what the family business literature, the economists have documented by way of empirical findings. And I'm going to start first with rich countries. And then I'm going to go to emerging economies. So here's what the stylized facts are from rich countries. And the very broad thrust of the evidence is mixed. To oversimplify, firm performance is best under founders. So if you compare firms that are managed by the founders to firms that are managed by non-founders, you find firms that are managed by founders appear to perform very well. Okay. And then after that, it gets a little bit more murky. And at least in advanced economies, if you look at firms that are managed by second or third or later generation heirs, they seem to underperform relative to firms that are managed by professional managers. Okay. And is this because there's a reversion to the mean? So you have a smart founder and then, a not so smart heir, and eventually what in economics we call the idiot son problem emerges, and then performance declines. Okay. So eventually succession issues spell the doom for family firms because all you need is one weak link in the chain. So that's the very broad oversimplified evidence from advanced rich economies. Now if you flip to emerging economies, actually no, let's talk about this guy, Andrew Carnegie. He's a US Gilded Age tycoon and he had a very famous conjecture. And he said, and I'm quoting him, inherited wealth generally deadens the talents and energies. And so one of his things was, by the way, this conjecture is supported in US tax data. Okay. And one of the things, he was a big, he supported a lot of charities, and he said, he who dies rich dies in shame. So one of his things was, donate all your money before you kick the bucket. Now let's move to the emerging economies, and here we find founders still do the best. So that's one thing in common. But then we can't really take much away from founders because we only observe the founders that manage to list their companies. So that's looking at a very biased sample of founders. You don't observe the founders who are not successful enough to list their companies. So you can take what you want from that evidence, but I think, in my opinion, that's a biased sample. But then if you look at the next two groups, what you find is that the order reverses. In emerging economies, biological heirs seem to outperform professional managers. And we can conjecture, we can make speculative answers to why this is the case. It could be that perhaps in emerging economies, the formal institutions are not strong enough to have trust across communities. So within community, trust is stronger. Therefore, family heirs are able to provide that continuity. It could be other networking possibilities. It could be any number of things. But here, my point is not to give you reasons behind that. I'm just presenting you some stylized facts. Now, why Japan? Why look to Japan? And here, the reason we want to do this is that it offers a very unique post-industrial setting. And it's often easy to overemphasize the uniqueness of Japan. But in this one case, I really think they are unique. And Families have not dominated Japanese corporations, at least in the post-war period. In the pre-war period, yes. Like I mentioned, the zaibatsus were family-based business groups, much like the Korean chaebolls today. But in the post-war business, the business groups, in the post-war history, the business groups in Japan are not family-based. They are what you call flat keiretsus. Keiretsus are business groups, but they're not based on families. So even though families have not dominated Japan, their influence is still material. I'm going to show you some pictures to show you what is the influence of families in Japanese corporate ownership and control. And here's a quick a graph of that. So we start in 1949. What this graph shows you is the number of new listings among all the Japanese stock exchanges from 1949 to 2000. And you can see a big spike in 1949, and that was the reopening of the Tokyo Stock Exchange after the war. So not surprisingly, there's a big spike there. And then there's another big spike in the early 1960s when the second tier of the Tokyo Stock Exchange was opened. And so it was obviously, for the next 3 years, you saw a whole bunch of new listings there. And then you see lots of new listings in the late 1980s. This was Japanese, the bubble period in Japan was the late 1980s when the Japanese stock market index, the Nikkei, reached about 40,000, close to 40,000. By contrast, the Nikkei index today is closer to 15,000. So if you invested money in Japan in 1989, you still haven't recovered a large chunk of it. Okay. What's the difference in the blue and the red? The red bars, the red portion of the bar represents IPOs that were family sponsored, and the blue ones are non-family sponsored IPOs. So as you can see, even in Japan, at least at the time of the IPO, a substantial number of these new listings were sponsored by families. Okay.
So very interesting observation here. Once you said after the war, the stock exchange opened. How come the non-family has a major share in that?
Corporations.
So that was a post-war scenario when the families were not yet in control or probably they were yet to come out of.
So the old families that were in control were persona non grata with the GHQ. So that was part of it was by design. So what in terms of percentages, about 40% of these companies are what you can classify as family firms, roughly equally divided between founder-controlled firms and firms controlled by second, third, or later generation heirs. And the heir control firms includes firms that are managed by professional managers but still owned by the sponsoring family. The remaining firms, 60%, are classified as non-family firms. This group includes ex-family firms as well. So in this regard, Japan resembles the US more than it resembles countries such as India, for example, where I would imagine the fraction of non-family firms, with the exception of state-owned companies and MNCs, would be close to zero. Okay. Succession style, and this is the unique part about Japan, which I assume or presume that many of you are not familiar with, is the practice of adopting adults into the family. And the succession strategy is largely focused on providing continuity for the house, which is called ie in Japanese. And so what does a house mean? So let's say you talk about the house of Mitsubishi. So the house becomes more important than the founder's own blood progeny. Okay? The continuity of the house becomes more important. And to oversimplify somewhat, this policy, or this tradition rather, states that in order to maintain the line of succession, you provide male heirs when none exist, and to substitute a more promising male heir when one owns does not measure up. So now we are thinking of a very sort of transaction-oriented, pragmatic approach to succession, not overly imbued by sentimentality. Okay. And so the adoption is in two possibilities here. One is that the adoptee is adopted into the family and takes on the family's last name, end of story. The other possibility is the adoptee marries one of the daughters of the family patriarch's daughter and is the son-in-law. Or the third possibility is you do both, 1 and 2, sometimes as a package. Okay. So, and this is, for me, this was a discovery, because to give you some idea where I would even think of doing something like this, I was visiting the Institute for Economic Research at Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo, and one of the professors there, who is not Japanese, she was a professor there, and so I mentioned that in the US, second, third generation family businesses don't do as well as professionally managed firms do, and because Japan is largely, it's a Western economy, it's an advanced economy, it's a rich country, I would expect the same in Japan. And her response was, no, Vikas, no. The Japanese heirs would do better than professional managers. And I said, why? And she said, well, the culture is different. And that's not a very satisfying answer for an economist. As an economist, we tend to sort of downplay culture and all that, because not sure why, I think because you can't measure culture. So she said, and so this argument was going nowhere because she had dug in, I had dug in, and so I said the only way to settle this is we collect the data, which was easier said than done because the data does exist. Hitotsubashi is phenomenally well-endowed university. They have a center for innovation, which they have all of the almanacs containing the history of family businesses, who the founder was, how many sons and daughters the founder had, which university he went to, just a phenomenal amount of data, except all in Japanese, and my Japanese was as good as my Greek was. Okay, so that didn't, so I said, what do we do now? She said, well, let's collect some research assistants, which is a tool of trade for economists. So we said, okay, so we got a PhD student. He was fluent in Japanese, even though he was Korean. And we packed him off, and he came back and said, there's no way he can handle this. The data are just too large. And so we needed a small battalion now. And so we started asking undergraduate students in Japan, but the clearing wage was too high. So then he collected a small group of Korean students whose wages were a little bit lower. And we managed to get all the data, but it's still in Japanese. And then we had to transcribe all of that into English, into Excel actually, so we can massage the data. And then we needed even cheaper wages, so we sent all of this to Bangalore. And we got it transcribed. But because I'm Indian, I know there's a small chance that the outfit in Bangalore may randomly put data in, so we sent it to 2 different outfits. And then we got 2 different sources back, and we cross-checked, and they were pretty much all the same. So we thought, okay, these are honest people, they have done a good job. So we got the data. It took us a year and $100,000, but we have all the data now. And then when we looked at the data, my friend was right, I was wrong. But I still didn't accept, because her reasoning about culture still seems dicey to me. So I said, yes, you're right, the data can't be wrong. I mean, we can have our own opinions, we can't have our own facts, well, unless you're Mr. Donald Trump. But we said, okay, what do we do now? So we were digging out, and then we, just by pure serendipity, we noticed that some of these successors had a different last name from the founders. And we're puzzling our head, we're scratching our head saying, this can't be. There's some problem in the data transcription or something. And then we said, I think it's time out here, because we need a Japanese now, because we are 2 foreigners bumbling in the dark here. So we talked to a senior professor, Teranishi Sensei, and he says, yeah, of course, this is common practice. This is because the Japanese business sometimes adopt outsiders into the family, And we said, what is that? So he says, well, the way it works is you adopt a promising young person into the family. And that led the door open. So we started doing research, and we found that this has been common practice not just in the modern Japanese era, but this practice of adopting adults goes back to the Tokugawa era, the feudal Japanese era. And it was used primarily as a succession tool. I said, okay, now it's starting to make sense. Now we were very excited by this time, but this is fascinating because it does allow families to bring in fresh talent. Not fresh talent as an agent, but fresh talent as a family member. Okay. Of course, how is this adoption done? How do you pick someone? You could pick somebody the day he's born, but that's a bit risky because it's difficult to predict how this baby how talented this would be. So it's far better to wait 25, 26 years, and then you can pick and choose. And that's the most common pool of adoptees. And if you're thinking, give me an example, okay, you're familiar with Suzuki. All of the CEOs of Suzuki have been adopted, all of them, including the current chairman, the patriarch, Mr. Isamu Suzuki. In fact, Mr. Isamu was grooming his adopted son to be the next CEO, but unfortunately he passed away in his 50s due to cancer. Now he has two of his own sons, so he could easily have given the reins of Suzuki to one of his own blood sons, but instead he came back from retirement and is now the chairman of the Suzuki Group, because the tradition of Suzuki has been to have adopted sons as the CEO of the company. Okay. So that's a brief history of how do you actually get the adoption process. How does it work? So once chosen, the adoptee has to divorce his biological parents in a court of law. It's a registry actually. And in this registry, and then after that, the adoptee often takes on the last name of the adopting family, owes his allegiance to the ancestors of the adopting family, and so on. And in many instances, like I said, it also marries the patriarch's daughter. Does it matter? Who cares? Does it matter? So this is where we come in. We want to look at the evidence, we want to look at the data and see if adoptions actually make a difference in terms of performance. So we looked at two things. We looked at many other dimensions as well. I'm presenting you two pieces of the evidence here, looking at profitability as well as sales growth. And the tests are very simple tests. I'm going to compare these two dimensions, profitability and sales growth, under firms that are managed by the founders versus heirs versus professional managers. And within heirs, I'm going to look at blood heirs and adopted sons. Okay? So think of this as a horse race. And in this horse race, I want to see, who is ahead. Also, we didn't see, at least in our post-war data, not one example of a female CEO, and that may have changed more recently, but in our data we didn't see that. So first, not surprisingly, we confirm what we already knew, that performance under founders is the best. So the founder horse wins, but we're not interested in the founder horse. Okay. We want to compare heirs and professional managers, and within heirs we want to compare adopted sons and so on. And so yes, heirs do well too, better than professional managers, and this is where my professorial friend, she wins the debate with me. And here's the kicker. Within heirs, adopted sons edge out blood heirs. Okay. How much so? I'll give you some data here, and this is the simplest. The actual results, economists like to do fancy statistical analysis with regression analysis and all kinds of clustered standard errors and this and that, which I'm not going to bore any of you with all of that. So I'll just give you graphs. Okay. So in the graph you can see the founder performance is the best, and then both blood heirs and adopted sons are superior to professional managers. Think of this as a return on asset kind of a metric, okay? A simple return on asset metric. And then within heirs, you can see the adopted sons appear to dominate blood heirs.
How big was the sample?
This sample is because this sample is a panel. This is 50 years of all listed companies in Japan. So this is a gigantic sample, but it's panel. So we want to move beyond panels and we want to look at what is called events. Events means I want to see what happens when one of these groups is replaced by another. So for example, a founder is replaced by a professional manager, or a founder is replaced by a blood heir, or a founder is replaced by an adopted son. So then we move to the event study sample. By the way, this equals sales growth, similar data. So when we move to succession events, we have a much smaller sample then. So a sample is, because succession events are not as common, on average you have one succession every 10 years. Okay. So it is possible that performance rankings are self-selected. For example, heirs might keep the well-performing firms either for themselves or to get someone else to manage relatively poorly performing firms. So then what you observe is nothing to do with heirs versus professional managers. It's just that the heirs keep the good stuff and let the bad stuff go, right? So to overcome these concerns, we said, okay, let's look at events, okay, where one of the incumbent CEO is replaced by a new one, and we want to identify who the new one is. So we collect a sample of all succession events in Japan in this 50 years panel, and we compare performance of firms before and after these succession events. And once again, we focus on many metrics, but I'm going to present you the evidence on profitability as well as sales growth. And let's look at return on assets first, which is a profitability measure. And what do these graphs mean? These graphs show you, relative to adopted sons, how well do blood heirs do. These are biological heirs. And that's about -2. So they underperform adopted heirs. What about professional managers? They do even worse. Professional managers underperform adopted sons by about 3%. Okay. What about sales growth? Similar picture emerges. Even sales growth, so the adopted sons' performance is superior both to blood heirs as well as professional managers, who both underperform adopted heirs. So this is a bit stronger evidence, a bit stronger than just looking at a 50-year panel and saying that heir run performance is better than professionally managed firm performance, because that could be because heirs keep the good stuff and let the bad stuff go out. Here, we're looking at succession events. To be fair, we did one more set of analysis using what in economics we call, econometrics, we call instrument variable regressions. And when we sent it to the journal for publication, the referee said, "Who asked you to do that? I already believe your results, get rid of that." So we said, okay, happy.
A small observation here, if I may.
Yes, please.
Slide. So this is the outcome, right? And this is in hindsight when we compare the blood heirs versus the professional manager. But all these, both these two options are available with the founder at a point in time. He has to probably make a choice, right? Now, at that point in time, looking forward, you have to take a call. So what exactly would be the parameters and what would go through his mind when he has to pick up option A versus option B? Because in hindsight we have the data to kind of prove that second category pressure manager did do as well.
So
maybe that's where the connect is.
So that's an excellent question, that the founder at the moment of succession, which could be when the founder is, let's say, 65, 70 years old, the founder wishes to turn in the horse reins and go home. Who does he pick, right? We looked into this, and it turns out this decision is actually, the decision to adopt is made a lot earlier. So you don't suddenly adopt someone when you're 70 years old. The adoption decision typically happens at least 20 years before. So you've already adopted someone, so now in your mind you're grooming the adopted son for the successor, but that happens with a very long lead time. A good 20 years. And that's actually good for us in many other ways. It's also good for us by saying that the decision to choose adopted versus a biological heir is not based on the immediate circumstance of the company, That decision was made a long time ago. So you can't tell me that the choice between adopted son and biological son was based on how well is the company doing.
But one thing is clear, that as far as the choice for professional manager is concerned, it always comes in.
True. Yes. So that I'm going to show you in this part of the talk now. So we're going to move on to now the choice between hiring professional managers. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. So I'm going to have to give you the elevator pitch version of this. So in this, let me just cut to the chase here, which is that why do families exit? What is important? Is finance more important, or is family network, family assets also important in making the decision to exit, what forms exit takes, and so on. The idea that finance is important goes back, including work by our own RBI governor, ex-governor now, Mr. Raghurajan. He's done work with Luigi Zingales, and the Rajan and Zingales papers show the extreme importance of finance in the dynamics of ownership. So how does ownership evolve over a firm's life? How do founders and their heirs exert or relinquish control over their firms? And what role do finance and family firms play? This is Mr. Carlos Slim saying, I want this family for at least 3 generations. Okay. So this is the passive. Passive dilution means that if you do nothing and your firm grows using finance, then your ownership dilutes. That's passive dilution. And this is Mr. J.P. Morgan, who was a master, the top investment banker at the turn of the 19th century, and he sort of allowed American ownership structure to passively dilute through his efforts in selling American equities across the Atlantic in Britain. Active dilution is different. Active dilution means the family actually sells. Okay? And this is largely due to President Roosevelt, who insisted on trust busting. In fact, the name antitrust comes from this era. And this led to a spate of active dilution in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. And the country still is largely sort of very different from continental Europe or India or Asia in terms of concentration of ownership. The UK and Japan look more like the US. The continental Europe doesn't. Okay. This is the dilution of ownership in Japan and the United Kingdom. What you can see is this is an IPO time. So you can see that the ownership dilution, the concentration of ownership dilutes over time. In Japan, there's a bit of a V there. That's the war. And after that, it follows the same path as the United Kingdom does. So yes, ownership does dilute over time. We actually confirm all of this using data, the same data that we had from Japan. And the 3 takeaways from this study are that first, we document that almost 50 years after the IPO, families in Japan continue to be involved in the firms they have founded. That's very interesting because they don't have any ownership by this time, and yet they have control. Second, we document that families often keep control over management even when their ownership rate is 0. Third, we document that it is not finance alone that matters in the ownership dynamics, particularly in explaining the dilution of ownership over time. In addition to finance, we are not saying finance is not important. We're saying in addition to finance, family constraints, what we call family roadblocks, are equally important, sometimes more important, in explaining the dilution of ownership over time. Okay. Those are 3 takeaways. 3 cases. The green bar, the green graph represents Casio. The blue bar represents Toyota, and the orange represents Suzuki. As you can see in Suzuki's case, the family ownership has been 0 for a very long time, and yet the Suzuki family is in control of the company. In Toyota's case also, the ownership you see there is actually not the Toyota family ownership. It's the ownership by Toyota Industries and Toyota Motors. Okay. And even that's minuscule, it's not big. The biggest owners of Toyota actually are financial institutions. In the case of Casio, you can see a sharp decline in ownership after the IPO. The IPO happened in the 70s. And since then, the ownership by the Casio founders has declined rapidly to the extent that today it's less than 5%. and yet they are in full control of the company. Okay. So let me, I might as well give you a short case history. So this is the Casio founders. This was founded in the 1950s, and these are the original machines they founded. The first product, a brief history of this. The point of this case vignette is to show you that ownership has been largely driven away, almost close to zero, without sacrificing control of the company. This is Toyota Motor. This is the first car they made. This is the model AA in 1936, started by Mr. Kiichiro Toyoda, and it's come a long way since, and still they are still in control despite the fact that their ownership is close to zero. By the way, this is one of the most expensive cars in the world. It's made by Toyota. Okay. So this is the ownership file. You can see that the ownership from 1962 onwards has been in the form of financial institutions, not the Toyota family, not even companies controlled by Toyota. Okay. The Toyota family is conspicuously absent among the list of the owners from the annual reports of the company. Okay. Let me finish by saying that exit modes. How do families exit? And then I'm going to stop and take questions from you. Actually, before that, you'll have some discussions for me. But let me show you how families exit. So think of families as having two dimensions. They can either have control over management or they can have ownership. And that's, if they have both, we call them type 1 companies. And let's say there's a type 1 company where the Casio family has ownership as well as control over the Casio computer company. Now they can do one of two things. They can lose their management of the company. Lose their management means they install a professional manager. This is one type of exit. This is actually the most common exit in family firms that we've discovered in our sample. The other possibility is they sell their ownership, so they have no ownership now, and yet they keep management control. This is the second most common type of exit we found in our sample. And the complete exit, where they sell both ownership as well as relinquish control over management, is actually only 3% of the cases. Okay. And so the big question for us is what explains these three different kinds of exits, and we find, to cut a long story short, that when you see ownership dilutions, finance ought to matter more because of the Rajan and Zingales conjecture that finance dilutes ownership when you bring in external capital. We confirm that in the data. The other exit, where you retain ownership, but you bring in an outsider to manage your company, that finance should be less important there. Family factors ought to be more important there. We observe that in the data as well. I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for listening, and I welcome Mr. Dalmia's comments.
Professor Mehrotra, most fascinating findings. In our own family, and we often quote this internally, we say that if you can keep your head above your shoulders for 3 generations, you get an empire. But if you can keep it on your shoulders for 5 generations, you get a dynasty. This was said mostly about royalty, but it's true for family businesses as well. And the Japanese obviously have managed to do that. They've created dynasties without even appearing as dynasties. I think one of the crucial questions here in my mind was the whole thought of business first versus family first. So if you look at it in a standard family business format, we think of family first and we try to optimize the role of the family or the family members, etc., and business considerations come thereafter. Clearly, in the Japanese context, the business considerations come primarily, and then adoption happens, and I'm sure it's not without stress when these adoptions happen, and they may have internalized that culturally now, but it must have been fairly complex. And it's quite remarkable. We were talking earlier this morning, just before this started, and Professor Mehrotra mentioned that even the Caesars in the Roman Empire, one after the other, they were adopted. So this practice wasn't invented by the Japanese. I mean, this has been best practice, quote unquote, even before. which was quite fascinating to me again.
Except the last Caesar.
Except the last Caesar, which is when the Roman Empire ended. You know, in my own experience with Indian family businesses, I find if you were to divide the challenges into level of competence and level of complacency, more often than not, I don't find challenges in level of competence. We see challenges more likely to be levels of complacency just because of the life young members, third, fourth, fifth generation members in family businesses have had. And I think this whole adoption idea actually takes care of this level of complacency when you bring in an outsider and groom him for 20 years to take over. In economics, there's this classical agency problem that if you hire a hired hand, so as to speak, he is not as well aligned with the needs of the shareholders. And we see this in Western companies all the time. And I think what many of the Japanese companies have done is they've tried to optimize and remove the agency problem, which I think is quite remarkable in how they've done this. If you look at, just extend the argument of agency problem to trust networks. I mean, one of the examples we see in the UK are a lot of the so-called Indian restaurants are actually run by Bangladeshis from one district. And they have their own trust networks and supply chain and this, that, and the other, which enables them to be more successful than their competitors. So they found their own way of trust networks and building their own little businesses. Yes, yesterday somebody sent me an article which I suggest all of you should read. And it's on foreign policy, but it applies to all kinds of decision making. And it's called Don't Underestimate the Power of Confucianism, which is not to do with Confucianism as in China, but confusion and Confucianism. And it talks about how under different kinds of pressure, as the world changes, as when there's a lot of internal stress and so on, what dominates decision making, and they take foreign policy examples, is confusion. And I've seen that, and I sent it to a bunch of my family members, and I got lots of email responses back last night. I see that happening in many family businesses when multiple generations are at work together, their needs are not well defined and curtailed, and so on and so forth. In the long term, I do believe family businesses are a great force in society. We've seen that in the German middle market companies. We see it in India. If you look at the listed sample in India, family businesses dominate. And they bring focus, long-term orientation, alignment, and strong cultures. And on the weak side, they often are not as meritocratic as they ought to be. They don't have very strong middle management in smaller businesses. And they're often corporate capital constrained because of the reluctance of family members to dilute. But net, family businesses actually in India have done remarkably well. And I think there are lessons Indian businesses can learn, whether it's from Japan, whether it's from Germany, whether it's from Bangladeshi networks. So thank you.